Oh, good morning and welcome to our seminar of Geopolitical Tuesday. I would like to especially thank Professor Delphine Deschaux-Dutard from the University Grenoble Alpes. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy to welcome you to her lecture entitled "Is the European Strategic Autonomy an Utopia? Reflections on the EU's defense and security policy in the context of the war in Ukraine." For our audience on the Zoom, please turn off your microphones and cameras. And also for your information, this conference is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. My name is Kinga Torbicka. I'm the research fellow at the Center for French Culture and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw. At the beginning, I will present our guest, then her lecture will start. Afterwards, we invite you to answer and question a session, and you could also write your comments during her lecture. Now, let me present our guest. Professor Delphine Deschaux-Dutard is an associate professor in political science at the University Grenoble Alpes, as well as a research fellow at Centre d'études sur la sécurité internationale et la coopération européenne. She's also the Deputy Dean for International Relations at the Law Faculty. She holds a PhD from Sciences Po Grenoble on the role of French and German diplomatic and military actors in the development of European defense policy since the 1990s. She has published several books, articles, and chapters on security and defense issues, and has presented more than 60 papers in scientific conferences in France and worldwide. Her recent publications, A Lamp in the Jungle, the EU and the Return of Power Politics with Bastien Nivet, 2023, and European Defense in an Interpolar Context, explaining the limitation of French-German contribution to European Strategic Autonomy 2022. Today, Professor Delphine Deschaux-Dutard will reflect upon the way the EU has tried to develop a strategic autonomy for several decades by investigating the case of European defense policy. The topic will also be reflected upon in the light of the current war in Ukraine and its consequences for the EU's strategic thinking and action in a more and more multipolar world. Please, Professor Delphine Deschaux-Dutard, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today to talk about a topic that, well, is very dear to me for several decades now, and that has been renewed by the last year's events in Ukraine. So I'm going to share my screen so that, well, I prepared a PowerPoint so that it makes it maybe easier for everybody to follow. But the main idea is really to help you, well, try to better understand what it is all about when we talk about European strategic autonomy. So the main question here is, well, is it an utopia? And what can we reflect, what we can think about European strategic autonomy when we focus on the specific area of defense in the light of the current context of the war in Ukraine? So this is going to be the topic for today. So maybe as a starter, it's important to recall that, well, even though European strategic autonomy might seem as a very new concept that is very trendy for only a few years, actually, it is quite an old idea. It is an idea as old as the De Gaulle era in the 60s, when De Gaulle had the idea of trying to create well, an intermediation between the two big blocs, the two big powers during the Cold War, by trying to consolidate a European way of thinking the world, which didn't completely succeed. But, well, this idea of making Europe a partner that could think independently from the others goes actually back to the Cold War and mainly to the 60s. And well, mainly then, after the Cold War, each big crisis that questioned the ability of the European Union to act as a global player tended to reignite this idea of, well, should we go further on the road to build a European strategic bloc or a European strategic autonomy, or should we keep going on with NATO, which is the existing alliance that has been created during the Cold War? So it's really an idea that goes back and forth. Each time we have turbulences, not only in the world, but also in the transatlantic relations. So you see that the Balkan Wars played a role in the development of the concepts. There was also an idea that was very popular in the 90s, and that seems to be popular again a little bit since the last few months, the idea of creating a European identity within NATO, which really, again, is not new because it's an idea that was quite popular after the Cold War, but that always was seen with a bit of mistrust by the USA until then. And this might be changing, and we might discuss the topic. So just to show you that European strategic autonomy, it's not really a new concept or a new idea, but it's an idea that has been going on for several decades. And actually, this idea of a European strategic autonomy has been taken up in the French defense white papers of 1994 and 28, and then in the strategic review, which is kind of the replacement paper for the white paper, in 2017. Because France has really been the country that tried to push the notion forwards, to advocate for European strategic autonomy. And it is very noticeable in several speeches made by President Macron since his first election in 2017. For instance, if you read the very famous speech on Europe given at the Sorbonne University in September 2017, here you have several times the idea of European strategic autonomy, and not only in defense, but in many areas, and mainly, well, the strategic area of defense, but also areas such as industry or such as the digital area, for instance. And this sometimes goes side by side with another topic that is also not quite new, but that also created lots of divergences between European countries, the idea of a European army that has been promoted by President Macron and the former Chancellor Merkel in November 1918. So you see that there's a very important connection between all these different notions. But if we really want to understand the connections between this notion and how it relates to the European construction, we first have to take a step back and to go back to, well, what is the European Union within international relations? And I think it's important, as some of you are bachelor students who maybe didn't study that much of the EU in the world. So it's still very important to go back to the basics, let's say. And basically, to say it with very simple words, the very project of European construction at first started as a European, well, as a security community. So maybe some of you are familiar with the concept, which was given by Karl Deutsch about NATO, actually in the 50s. And what is a security community? It's a gathering of states, so a group of states within which violence is forbidden. So it means that within the security community, you can have misunderstanding and divergences with the other members, but the way you solve these misunderstandings is no more violence, but it is negotiation. It is mediation or negotiation, and mainly direct negotiation. And since the beginning of the European adventure, since the Schuman Declaration in 1950, the European community has been conceptualized as such a community within which the members will exchange their views on the European project and will negotiate as part of their daily job, but will not relate to violence to solve the divergences. So you see that it's very important to keep that in mind, because, well, we will try to see how this relates to the idea of strategic autonomy. There's another concept that is interesting when we try to look at the EU within international security. It's the concept of regional security complex that we owe to Barry Boutsen, who actually, envisages security at the regional level. And mainly the concept here means that countries sharing the same geography or the same neighborhood may share the same challenges, security challenges, which will push them to cooperate to face these kind of challenges. And it is actually what we have been witnessing within the European construction, not only about security questions with the development of a European defense policy, and I will explain it a bit more during the presentation, but with many topics. When you look at migration questions, for instance, as the financial crisis, well, all the challenges faced by European member states of the EU are actually mainly tackled collectively. It doesn't mean that they don't tackle it also nationally, but they have developed like a reflex of tackling the issues collectively. The last element of concept, which is important to keep in mind to better understand how fast the EU has evolved in the last, well, let's say 2-3 decades, is the concept of civilian power. Actually, the EU has been, conceptualized as a civilian power since the 1970s. And actually, well, one of the big authors is François Duchesne here. And what does it mean to be a civilian power? It means to rely on tools which are not hard power tools, so no military coercion, for instance, but mainly on tools such as democracy, rules, rule of law, etc. And it's mainly what the EU has been doing until the end of the Cold War, trying to influence its neighborhood by using civilian tools and not, well, soft power tools, let's say, and not hard power tools. So now that the concept have been cleared, what is the issue here? What is the problem at stake? The main problem, when you think about European strategic autonomy.
Sorry for the interruption, because we see all the time the first slide.
Oh, okay. So I think that, oh yeah, I don't know why this happens. This sometimes happens to me when I do lectures. So I'm going to find another way. So if I stop the sharing and then share again, this should work this time. Yeah. Okay. So do you see the slide 5?
Yes, issue.
Ah, good. So
okay,
what is the main issue at stake here, and what is the problem? Before continuing, if needed, I can also submit my PowerPoints if needed for the students. So if they need to keep like this as a support for the conference, I can send it to you so that they also have the support.
Thank you.
So what is the main problem at stake when we think about European strategic autonomy? The main issue, and it's made very clear by the war in Ukraine currently, is does it really make sense? And does it mean the same thing for all the European countries? And actually, we will see, we will discover it, and we'll probably have also discussions about it. We'll see that no, actually, what Germany thinks about European strategic autonomy is not exactly the same as what France thinks about European strategic autonomy, and it will be different in Poland or in Czech Republic, for instance, or in the Baltic states. So does it make sense, and what sense, if so? And how can this topic be thought in the specific field of defense? And what are the main consequences of the war in Ukraine on this very notion of European strategic autonomy? So to try and understand the issue, we will go a little bit back in the past to better understand where European defense comes from and where it meets the idea of autonomy. And we will see what kind of means and tools the EU has developed even long time before the war in Ukraine, and how, well, what are the challenges on these tools and on this issue of, well, being autonomous in the strategic field, and what does the war in Ukraine change, what kind of evolutions it brings, etc., etc. So, but before starting with the history, it's always important to try to give a definition to European strategic autonomy. And actually, it's quite difficult because when you look at, well, either the European strategic texts, but also the academic literature on the topic, you can't find one and only definition, but actually, you can find several types of definition, and the term itself, European strategic autonomy, seems very often to be a blurred or a confused term, which is sometimes, and I would say, which is even more and more replaced by the idea of European sovereignty. And you see that already between the idea of autonomy and the idea of sovereignty, we have something of a different nature. It's quite different. So what we can try to agree on today for the presentation is to define European strategic autonomy as the capacity or the ability for the EU to act on its security environments by choosing whether or not to resort to third-party assistance, meaning many times NATO assistance or the United Nations, the UN assistance, and of course, Washington's assistance. And how to do so? By equipping itself with the means to be able to make this decision. Can we, as the EU, act alone in the case of a crisis management, for instance? And there are mainly 4 related dimensions of European strategic autonomy in terms of defense. There's a political dimension, an institutional dimension, a capability dimension, and an industrial dimension. And I will try to give you elements on all of these 4 dimensions to show you how far the EU is on the way of trying to act autonomously and what is still missing. So if we start with history, actually you see that, well, I already said that the idea of a European strategic autonomy is not new, but as you can see, it is actually even, well, older than what I said before, because, well, it's not so much historical fetishism on my side, but I think it's always important to provide this example of the 17th century, which is, well, in my opinion, the first attempt at creating something European in the defense, in the security sector. So in the 17th century, one of the ministers of Henry IV, who was a French king, the Duke of Sully, had an idea which was called the Grand Dessin, the big design or the big picture if you want. And this Grand Dessin was kind of a first attempt of creating a European community of 15 members, so at the time monarchies, with a collective council, which would be allowed to make joint decision and which would set up a joint budget to finance a joint European army. So why is this example interesting? Because actually today in 2023, we're not as far as the idea of the Duke of Sully, because we have no common budget, no European army, and there are many limits to the way the European Council can make decisions. But you see already in the 17th century, there was this idea of creating something within Europe to, well, try to make common decision when it comes to security. Now, if we make a big jump in time, the first very concrete attempt at creating a European strategic autonomy, it's the episode of the European Defense Community, which goes back to the 50s. So it was imagined in 1950 during the Korea War, when the United States, who had a lot of soldiers stationed in Europe, needed to bring some of these soldiers to Asia to face the war in Korea. So the idea was that, well, in order to transfer these American soldiers that were in Europe to Asia, they needed European soldiers to replace them. And their main idea that they discussed with the French and the British was to recreate a German army. But as you can imagine, so close to the war, it was something that was impossible to imagine, mainly for the French, who really didn't want to hear a word about the idea of, well, recreating a German army. So the plan that was discussed between Washington, Paris, London, but also Bonn at the time, was to create a European army based on the 6 countries that started the European integration process, which would actually give up their national armies to build a European army which would be placed under NATO's command, and they would only keep their special forces and their sovereignty forces. So there again, you see that it's quite of a revolutionary idea, the idea of giving up its own army to create something collective, to face collective dilemma. Well, today in 2023, we are far from this. So the plan to create this European Defense Community was discussed for 4 years. And when it came back to the French Assembly for ratification, it was a big failure because, well, the opposition within France concerning the topic was so intense that the French Assembly decided not to sign the treaty. And this really put a huge taboo on European defense for almost 50 years. So we had to wait until the end of the Cold War, actually, to talk again about a European defense which would not be exactly NATO. And what, again, opened the discussion was the end of the Cold War with, well, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, of course, the reform of NATO, which had to justify its existence, so which started reforming itself a lot. But also the Balkan Wars created a very important trauma for the European member states, because the war that was even closer than the war in Ukraine today showed then that they were unable to act, to decide something collective, to stop the parties at war, and they had to rely on NATO to stop the war twice, in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. And that is why, in this context of the Balkan Wars, again, the idea of, well, creating a European defense that would be aside from NATO, that could be autonomous from NATO, was discussed again. And it could be discussed because the British, who were very opposed to the idea until then, have been so much shocked by the events in the Balkans and mainly in Kosovo, that they decided to sign an agreement in Saint-Malo in December 1998, which led to the launch of the European Security and Defense Policy in June 1999. So you see that again here, crises really play a very important role in pushing the topic on, making the EU able to decide when it needs to be involved in the management of crisis. And actually, French-German couple has played a very important role in the promotion of this idea since the beginning of the, the beginning of the 90s. And until recent years. I would nuance it now because when you look at the state of the French-German couple in the last, I would say 10 to 12 months, it seems quite difficult to talk about the French-German engine anymore because we see quite a lot of misunderstandings between France and Germany. But until 2020, Paris and Berlin really pushed quite hardly the topic of making the EU able to act, even in the defense topic, even though they had different ideas about how to do it and, what link should be made with NATO. But you see what is important here is to recall that actually the topic European strategic autonomy and more globally European defense really evolves through crisis. So each crisis makes the EU more aware that it needs to act more collectively to face the security dilemmas that arise in its neighborhood. And actually, the events that happened in the last decade gave even more of a push to the topic. Because, the international context as such has been very troubled since then. Of course, you all recall the annexation of Crimea in 2014, for which the European Union didn't really react as much as it should have. The war in Syria, which provoked a lot of divergences between European members, but also globally between the big powers in the world, the terror attacks in Europe in 2015 and 2016, then the Brexit, which made the UK leave the EU. So all these events really, again, push forward the idea of, creating a European strategic autonomy as being something important. And it has been highlighted not only in the speech at the Sorbonne in September 2017, but also during the French presidency, who was held between January 2022 and July 2022. And actually, one of the big priorities of the French presidency, even before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, was pushing forward the idea of strategic autonomy. Because, one of the aims was the adoption of the strategic compass, which is the latest European strategic document that has been adopted in March 2022, and that actually had been discussed long before the beginning of the war in Ukraine, since the German presidency in 2020. So you see that we had lots of impetuses in the last decade to push the idea of, what could the European Union do to better be able to act, if needed, on the international security scene. So now that we have the panorama or the historical panorama of how this evolved until today, it's important to focus on an aspect that we saw in the definition, the institutional dimension. So institutionally, what can the EU do and what are the legal dispositions that exist to make the EU able to act in terms of defense and security? So the main legal provisions are to be found in the Lisbon Treaty. And actually, there is mainly one very important article that has been discussed last year. It's the Article 42, paragraph 7, which is also called the Common Defense Clause. So what is this clause? This clause is actually very much like the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty for NATO, and it actually recalls the obligation of solidarity of the member states if one of them is under attack. So what does it mean? It means that if a member state of the European Union is under an armed aggression, and that he will trigger this clause, all the other member states will need to help this state under aggression with whatever means they want. So it's really an obligation of solidarity, but there's no obligation of means. So each member state can decide what means and what tools they will use to help the member state under attack. And to give you an example, this article, so this common defense clause, has been only triggered once until then, after the Paris attack in 2015. President Hollande had decided to trigger this clause and not the Article 5 of NATO, because he had the idea of, well, showing European solidarity to face the terrorist threat. And concretely, each member state proposed different solutions to France to help target military targets in Syria, so military targets of the Islamic State in Syria, and to either bomb them or to give intelligence information, to give medical assistance. So each member state was able to choose how they would help France to react to this aggression. So that's the first and very important article that you can find in the Lisbon Treaty. There is a second clause which is very important that is not in the Lisbon Treaty, but that is in the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, and it's the Article 222, which is also known under the name Solidarity Clause. And sometimes in the media, there's a mix-up between the Common Defense Clause, which is really like, well, the Article 5, but within the EU, and the Solidarity Clause, which is actually of wider scope and which is a bit different. Why is it different? The Solidarity Clause actually allows the mobilization of the institutional elements of the European Union to help a member state face, let's say, a very unusual event, like, for instance, a natural catastrophe, like a terror attack, like a man-made disaster. Like, imagine like something like Fukushima, for instance. Well, we could trigger the Solidarity Clause. It could even be triggered in the case of a severe cyber attack affecting a member state, for instance. And here the main difference is that it's not the member states that will react in solidarity, but it's really the European institutions that will provide the solidarity to the member states that needs it at the time. So you see that really this idea of solidarity and facing threats solidarily is really enshrined in the legal provisions of the European Union. What is also interesting is that we have several bodies helping the EU to take decisions when it comes to defense and security. So, of course, the body that is maybe the most mediatic, the better known body, it's the European Council, so the meeting of the heads of states. And actually, it's really the main body, because the European Council, which will decide the guidelines of European defense policy and will actually give the big orientations. And then once these guidelines have been given by the heads of states, who meets at least twice a year, and actually they meet more than that. It's about 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a year, depending on the actuality. Then these guidelines will need to be implemented by the ministers. So you have a Council of the Defense Ministers and by the permanent bodies in Brussels. So there is something a bit funny concerning the Council of the Defense Ministers. As you may know, there are several formats of councils of ministers within the European construction. You have, for instance, the format ECOFIN for the ministers of finance who meet regularly once a month. There's also a very an existing format for the ministers of foreign affairs. Concerning the defense ministers, they actually have no formal meeting format, and it has a concrete implication. It means that they technically have no room or no building in Brussels for their meeting. So their meeting will be held in the different capitals of the European Union. For instance, there was one in Prague in summer. There was one in Brest in France last year. So each time they need to meet formally, they will actually go to one of the European capitals. And then to ensure the follow-up of the different files and to ensure the implementation of the guidelines decided by the heads of states, you have permanent bodies in Brussels that will not only follow up on the different actions that the EU might take on defense, but they will also plan the European mission that will be deployed on the ground. Like, for instance, the most recent mission, which is a training mission sent by the EU to train Ukrainian soldiers, and that actually takes place part in Germany, part in Poland, I think. And the main idea is to train several thousands of Ukrainian soldiers until December 2023. And these kind of missions are actually managed by the permanent bodies in Brussels. So there are mainly three: the PSC, which is the Political and Security Committee. To say it very easily, it is the ambassadors, so it's the political committee. Then you have the EU Military Committee, the EUMC, which is mainly the officers representing each member state. And in between, you have the EU military staff, the EUMS, which is a body that is not intergovernmental, which means that the officers that you find there do not represent their states, but they work for the European collective interest, and they are here to plan the missions and to propose concepts for European mission. You might also know that the EU has now a voice and a face. He is currently Mr. Borrell. So he's not as much as a European Minister for Foreign Affairs, but he's kind of the person that represents the EU in the world, and that will discuss with the member states for the big decisions like sanctioning a country like Russia, for instance. When you look at the 10 packages of sanctions taken by the EU against Russia, here, Mr. Borrell has played the role of coordination between the different member states, because these kind of sanctions are taken with the rule of unanimity. And there has also been a new player for a few years, within the Commission, and that's quite new, because before the Commission really had nothing to do with defense. But since 2019, so the new Commission, there is a DG, so a general directorate dealing with defense, but mainly on the industrial aspect. And it is led by the French Commissioner Thierry Breton. So mainly this direction of the European Commission will deal with European defense project to be developed by European industries. So you see that we have several tools, actually, several institutions that make the EU able to decide whether it will act or not in case of a crisis in its neighborhood. The EU also has strategic thinking, strategic documents. So mainly there are 3 plus 1 specific cyber documents. So there is the European Security Strategy, the first one that was adopted in 2003. Then you have the Global Security Strategy adopted in 2016. And the last one, which is the Strategic Compass, adopted in March 2022. So there again, even though these documents still remain quite vague with no very concrete priorities, well, even though the last one has set the idea of creating a rapid reaction capability of 5,000 people, mainly the strategic documents show that the EU collectively thinks about strategy and tries to develop ideas about strategy. And it's interesting to compare actually some keywords when you take the three main documents. And the keywords that appear the most in the main documents are the word threat. And you see a very important increase in the word threat between the first document and the last one, the strategic compass, the word military, but also the word cyber, where we see that really cyber has become a topic of preoccupation for the EU when they think about strategy. When we come to tools, so we saw that there are institutions. We also saw in the definition of European strategic autonomy that, well, another means to develop it is to develop tools. And on this side, the EU also has several kinds of tools. Well, one very traditional, and I would say the oldest tool that the European community has developed is the tool of mediation. So being able to propose mediation between parts that will share conflict, and which is also the tool that has been developed by the UN Security, by the UN Charter since the end of the World War II. We also see the tool of sanction that we heard a lot about in the last year, but the EU also developed civilian and military tools. So when we talk about civilian tools, it's mainly policemen and lawyers who can be deployed somewhere to rebuild, for instance, a judicial and legal system, like the EU-LEX mission in Kosovo, for instance. There was also a European mission sent to Iraq 10 years ago to try and rebuild administrative system. So technically they sent officials to try and rebuild an administration there. But the EU also develops military tools. So mainly there are the battle groups. Battle groups are military units. They are permanently under alert. And well, technically, these battle groups have been designed to answer crises in the neighborhood of the EU and to be able to send quite quick, which means, well, under the duration of 6 days, 1,500 soldiers until 6,000 kilometers from the EU. But what is a bit tricky is that these battle groups that exist for more than 10 years, they have never been used. So it's mainly paper military units that have never been used. And the last document, so the strategic compact adopted last year, has set the idea of creating a new tool, which would be a 5,000 soldier reaction force. But this remains to be seen because, well, if the problem is the same as for the battle groups, meaning that, well, the battle groups being composed of soldiers from different states, of course, each state will have different decision-making system when they need to send troops abroad. So how would it work with this rapid reaction force? The EU doesn't give any answer. So the fate of this rapid reaction force might be the same as the battle group. So mainly the paper units. But, well, at least there's something on the paper. The EU also developed a mini military headquarters to plan military mission since 2017 without needing to use the NATO headquarters. But there again, there are many limits because it's a very limited headquarters, which can only plan non-executive missions, so meaning non-high intensity, no combat mission. So it's mainly training missions. And well, as we see the developments of the war in Ukraine, it seems quite clear that in the future, training missions will not be the only task the EU might need to fulfill in the field of defense. There's also the tool of PESCO, and we can go back to this tool if needed, but well, mainly with PESCO, the idea is to have several groups of countries developing defense projects in all the areas of defense. It can be the area of cyber, it can be military medicine, for instance, intelligence, etc. And it's really gathering into smaller groups to act together. There's also a European Defence Fund, trying to finance European defense projects in the European defense industry. And there's also been an initiative outside the EU, which is the European Intervention Initiative, launched by the French president in 2018 with the participation of the UK. And there again, until now, it has mainly been something on paper because, well, there's been some exercises, but this initiative has never concretely acted in any crisis. So you see that, again, there are tools, there are institutions, but they still remain to be used if needed. And this is just a map to show you that, well, this is not common known fact, but actually the EU has currently lots of missions. So this map is not completely up to date because it is lacking the last mission launched by the EU, which is the EU BAM Ukraine, which has been launched last November. But you see that the EU has actually sent military and civilian missions in several continents to help act on resolving crises. So the EU is not inactive, but it's not really mediatized. So given all that we saw, and to go slowly to the conclusion, we've seen that the EU has lots of institutional tools, capabilities, possibilities to make collective decisions. So why is European strategic autonomy still so difficult to reach today? So is it only a political slogan? And here I will just point out some recurring challenges, but of course we can discuss it further during the question time. But mainly there are several elements that make European strategic autonomy, well, quite difficult to concretize currently, even in the context of the war in Ukraine. The first challenge is the disagreement within European member states on what it really means. And actually, as there's no common European strategic culture at present, each country will still rely on its national strategic culture, which means having different interests in terms of strategic priorities. And clearly, in the case of the French, for instance, even though the war in Ukraine drawn much attention on the question of the security of the eastern flank, France continues looking with lots of anxiety towards South, of course, towards Sahel mainly, and towards Africa and the Middle East, because, well, we see that there's lots of instability. And this kind of priority is not seen the same way by other member states, and it's completely logical because each member state will develop their own strategic culture that will help design what are their strategic priorities. So that's the first element, making European strategic autonomy a very difficult concept because, well, nobody really agrees on where the EU should prioritize its security interest outside the case of helping Ukraine. Second element, the difficulty when it comes to deploying multinational troops. Because within the EU, but it's exactly the same within NATO or for the UN Blue Helmet, for instance, when you want to deploy soldiers outside your borders, actually the decision-making systems are very different according to each member state. To give you just an example to illustrate this element, in the case of France, the president can decide that in 3 days, we will send 2,000 soldiers in Africa, for instance, and there's no consultation of the parliament on the issue. He can even consult nobody on the issue, so he better consult with the General Chief of Staff just to make sure that we have the available troops, but he can decide alone to do that, and the Constitution allows it. And the parliament, the French parliament, will only be consulted if the soldiers deployed stay on the ground more than 4 months. And actually, after 4 months, can the parliament decide to veto an operation well, it of course never happened, because you can't give the soldiers the idea that you mistrust them. So technically, the French president can really decide whenever he wants to send soldiers outside. If you compare it with the German system, it's very different, because in the case of Germany, if Germany wants to deploy German soldiers of the Bundeswehr outside the German borders, they first need to consult the parliament, which will need to vote ex ante, which means before the deployment. And well, depending on the mandate of the mission, depending on where the mission happens, actually the discussions can really be not only very heavy, very polemical, but it might take time. I remember being in Berlin in the spring 2006, when the decision was made by the European Union to send a military mission to Congo. And it was actually a mission to observe the first democratic election in Congo. So no combat mission. The main idea was sending a few hundreds of European soldiers just to make sure that this election would happen in a peaceful context, and that everybody could go voting without being threatened by one of the factions in the country. And I was in Berlin at this time, and I went several times to the parliament to listen to the discussions on the mission. And actually, the discussions on this mission, which was not even implying combat, actually, took many, many weeks in the German parliaments, because, well, the German the German members of parliament were very anxious about, well, will there be children soldiers? What happens if there are, and if they shoot at our soldiers? Can we reply? Is it legitimate defense? It is the African ground. We don't want to go on the African ground, etc., etc. So just this example to show you how much even a mission like this one, which was not a combat mission, might take time to be discussed in Germany, because the strategic culture in Germany is quite different from the one we have in France, or the one that might be in Poland or in the Baltic states, for instance. So that's another difficulty, the caveats. And if you want to develop multinational troops, of course, you will be faced with these caveats, which are the political limitations. Third challenge, the budgetary issue. So, of course, the defense budget in Europe have been increased a lot since the war in Ukraine, but even before. Actually, the trend to enhance the military budget started before, but they have been increased a lot in the last 12 months. But there is still no real common budget concerning defense. And when you look at the European Union, there are still very different levels of military spending. Again, just to take the example of Germany, you know that the German Chancellor made this big announcement last spring to give this special fund, this famous 100 billion euros for the German defense budget. But does it make the German defense budget closer to the 2% NATO standard? Actually, no, because even with this special budget, special funding, Germany is still around 1.3, 1.4% of the GDP dedicated to defense, which is far from the case of Poland, for instance, or the Baltic states, or the case of Italy or France. So you see that there are still very different levels of military spending within the EU. There's the question of the EU-NATO relations, which is an enduring divergent question between the member states, and mainly between France and the other member states. And also, the last challenge is the lack of a real European defense markets. And just to give you an example here again, you can think about the purchase of the F-35 aircraft by Germany last year, for instance, or the divergences between European member states on the air defense systems. So there again, no real European defense industry that would, well, need to be developed. So, and yet, and this will be the conclusion, to finish on maybe on a more positive note, there are some prospects that result from the context in Ukraine that are to be confirmed in the coming months and years. So the first element that changed is the interest from states that, well, until then were keeping aside from German defense, and they started developing an interest for European defense policy. And it is the case of Denmark that decided to lift their opting out to join the European defense policy. So that's the first element showing that, well, things are evolving. A second element is the development of European reflection on space, but also on cyber and on the digital domain, which has been enhanced again by the war in Ukraine, because, well, we see that these are the domain in which the EU needs to go much further in the future. Also, the case of the European Peace Facility. So it's a tool that had been created in 2021, and it's a tool that actually allows the collective financing of the arms deliveries to Ukraine. And what is interesting is, well, in the years before the war in Ukraine, when it came about the idea of spending something collectively for defense or for military missions, discussions always took months and months between the member states. Here, in the case of the European Peace Facility, not only it was decided to activate this tool 2 days after the beginning of the war, so it's really quick when you know a little bit the EU decision-making system, but also what is interesting is that the Council decided to top up the facility more and more, so several times, to bring it to close to 8 billion today. So at first it was 5.5 billion, and it has been increased, and it could be increased even more in the coming years. So, and the European member states made no difficulty taking this collective decision. And last but not least, something that also shows a real evolution is the future coordination on the collective acquisition of ammunitions that will be delivered to Ukraine. And that was decided in March 2023, because there again, the idea of collectively buying ammunitions and financing it with a line of the European budget, it was a dream for some states many decades ago, but nobody thought until now that it could come true. And actually this is happening. So there have been evolutions that show that, well, European strategic autonomy is not yet a concrete thing, but that Europe is evolving. But the main question remains, well, can Europe really be something without NATO? And well, the main answer to the question given by most of the member states is actually no. So aside the case of France, which has some mixed feelings toward NATO, it seems quite clear that for all the other European member states, NATO remains the anchor of our collective security in Europe. And it's even the case for France, actually, because when you look at the last French strategic review, which was updated last fall, so in November 2022, it is very interesting to see that NATO now comes first before European strategic autonomy within this document, which is really the first time this happens in France. So this shows that, well, even though Europe made lots of evolutions, we're still very far from having an EU that would be able to act autonomously if the American allies decided to say, well, now you need to take your security into your hands alone. So I'm stopping for now. I've already talked too much. So thank you very much for your attention. And now let's have the discussion. So I'm really open for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Thank you very much for your perspective, French perspective on the EU defense and security policy in the current context. So now we invite you to ask the question and comment. You can write your question and comment on the chat. I see one hand, from the question from Ihar Murashka, please.
Thank you for election. Thank you for election and French perspective on strategic autonomy. But is it possible? Do you believe that it become true somewhen in I don't know, short perspective? Because like even now French behave like very strange. Still is not very active support Ukraine, trying to negotiate some, I don't know, terms of peace with Russia, showing, I don't know, making reportages from Russian military bases in occupied territories, providing assistance with, not assistance, but talking about closer relations with China that support, like, in fact, Russia, etc. Like, when eastern part of European Union is in danger by Russia, France still behave itself like everything is okay. Oshan could, I don't know, supply Russian army with support, with products, etc., etc. Maybe France that is proclaiming the idea of strategic cooperation and autonomy of EU should be like more leader and think about, I don't know, other members, not about their vision and how to make, I don't know, French language more popular and more influential, something like this. Maybe it's quite tough and negative comment, but now French politics in foreign affairs quite, I don't know, not good. Like.
So do you want me to answer right away or to take other questions?
No, please, you could answer already, yes.
So thank you very much for this question. And actually, well, I'm glad that I'm not representing the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'm not actually completely, let's say, in agreement with some of the French positions for many years. But I think one of the keys to understand the behavior of France, and mainly of the behavior of our president, who really plays a very important role in diplomacy, is that, well, how can I say? Well, the word has been summed up by one of our former presidents, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and it is France still behaves as a big power, even though it has become a middle-range power. So we keep having this idea of grandeur, you know, this idea of France being part of the club of the big powers in the world. And it is the way I understand what our president is trying to do with diplomacy. But it is to say that actually, when you look at the French press currently, and mainly when you lead interviews, and as I'm currently leading interviews in France, it seems quite clear that actually this diplomacy developed by the French president is not always well understood, even by French diplomats. And they don't really have the choice than to follow, but it doesn't mean that they really completely share this idea of, for instance, being proposing friendship to China, etc., etc. But still, I think it's really the idea that goes back to the goal, the idea of, well, being a power in between the big powers, proposing a third voice in between the big powers. And I think that's, well, one of the criticism that has been made to France in the last decades, and that is actually recurring, is a little bit French arrogance toward many European member states. And I actually share this criticism. I really think that France should have better listened to all of its European partners, and mainly the Eastern members, like the Eastern Central countries, the Eastern Central European countries and the Baltic countries. And we should have taken into account with more seriousness their fear about the Russian threat, because they were right. Actually, they were completely right. And I think that one of the biggest criticisms that has been addressed to France, but also to Germany, is that they tried to negotiate with Putin even before the beginning of the war. They made an attempt, France and Germany, to invite Putin to discuss with the other European member states in July 2021. And actually, the other member states declined the idea. And I guess that they were right. But I think that there has been kind of a misunderstanding by France and Germany, but mainly by France, because of these ideas. Well, France being an influential country because we have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, because there is the nuclear dissuasion that France has. So because of the assets that France still has, that are normally assets of a big power, and France has difficulties to realize that it is maybe not a big power anymore, and that it should better communicate with its partners if it wants more collective action.
Thank you very much. Very interesting topic. I think it's very good to show and to observe how France also changed the attitude towards this conflict and towards this war in Ukraine. It's very also interesting. Maybe France's position will influence this European strategic autonomy in the future. If there is another questions or comments, please don't be shy. Professor is for you for answer your question. So I will ask you about what, in your opinion, you talk about European security. What do you think, what challenges in the current situation in Europe, and what threats should determine the efforts of France in the process of developing security and defense policy in European Union in this moment today?
So that's a very good question, and actually there are some answers that I can read, because we are in the discussion about the law about the financing of the army, which is really a big moment each year in France, and we are currently within the discussion about, well, how much funding we will give the French army and what for. And of course, this, well, the reflection of, well, budget drives the reflection about, well, what France thinks about defense in the European dimension, and how to finance it better. And what is quite striking when we look at, well, this discussion currently on the French defense budget, but also the last strategic review, is that, well, in my feeling, I feel that there's like a bit of a hiatus between speeches and facts. When you look at speeches, actually, Macron again talked about European strategic autonomy a few days ago, but in the last months, he didn't really make it a topic anymore. And not only in the debate on the budget, but also in the new strategic review updated in November 2022, it has actually decreased in importance, because what is really, well, the top priorities in French defense currently are, well, clearly, number one, dissuasion, nuclear dissuasion, the idea of being autonomous with a nuclear dissuasion, and number two, equipping our army better, because the war in Ukraine made it quite clear for many European member states, and it's the case of France, that our armies lack very important elements if we were faced with a direct conventional threat. And actually, the discussions and the priorities of French defense at the moment really rely on the idea of how to better cooperate in defense industry in the European Union to face, well, the competition with others in the world and to better, rationalize our spending to equip our military forces. So I really think that it is the topic that France is pushing the most currently, also because France has many interests. We have a big industrial defense sector, of course, and France has really seen in a very bad way the fact that Germany, for instance, decided to rely on other partners to develop their air defense system, even though when you know a little bit about the German strategic culture, it was actually logical. It was the logical choice. But still, when I go interviewing people in the French Ministry of Defense or in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I really feel that it is the topic of misunderstanding and that they really want to push the topic of defense industry within Europe in the coming months.
Yes, this is very interesting topic because we spoke the more and more about this misunderstanding, but also from the other perspective, the misunderstanding between this East and Est Europe. So we will see what the future will bring us. So if there is no question, I will continue. I saw one conference on the YouTube with your participation 1 month ago in the conference at the UBC Political Science. You spoke about also European security and France-German cooperation. And you said that in your opinion, European Union is not today a superpower because this institution doesn't have this influence on the international relations. Is not viewed like a serious actor at the international political arena. What, in your opinion, is the alternative? Maybe the NATO, more NATO in Europe, maybe another regional organization. Maybe also I ask myself, there is a conflict with a very French vision of make Europe a global power?
Actually, the question of the EU power is also a question that goes back to the beginning of the European construction. And we see that in today's world, where realpolitik is really dictating the behavior of the main political powers in the world, actually the EU remains most of the time unheard because, when we go discussing with China, even if the president of the European Commission was in the airplane of the French president, actually it's quite clear that, the Chinese president wanted to talk with a head of state, and not only with the European Commission. It's the same with Putin, who actually doesn't see the EU as something that really exists. He believes in states and in real politics and in, the real world, let's say, and he doesn't believe in international organizations like the European Union. So I really think that the EU is a bit like, I don't remember who said it like that, but I thought it was very interesting. It's like an herbivore in the world of carnivores, meaning that the EU continues to advocate for a rule-based order, for a liberal order, for multilateralism, which is good, which is really, I think it's really the sense of history. But I fear that most of the other big powers on the planet don't really see it this way. And the alternative, I would say that the only alternative is to develop further the European Union as a global power. And it can only be done, in my view, by cooperating with NATO. And why not developing this idea of a European identity within NATO? If some days, and this day might happen, the Americans say, okay, we gave you a lot of help, a lot of money, a lot of time, but we also have our challenges, and mainly they are in Asia, and it's the famous pivot to Asia, but we'll leave you with this alliance that works, that, well, has been working for 70 years now, that help people exercise together. And I think that's really is the way to better enhance the cooperation between NATO, which is only a military alliance, with European Union, which is something more. So to better articulate the two dimensions and not to duplicate what is done within NATO, because clearly we don't have twice the money for that.
Yes, it must be compatible to NATO and the EU in the new geopolitical order in the new Europe. So I think we will stop here if there is no question, and your presentation was very rich and very, very intense and interesting. So thank you again, thank you very much. And I hope we will see another time, maybe in Warsaw. I invite you to our next seminar, 9 of May, Dr. Paramita from University Bina Nusantara in Jakarta will present geopolitics of Southeast Asia. So thank you for this seminar and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.